everybody. Welcome to Spirit Coffee Talk. Happy Friday, Feel Good Friday. Myself, Elyse, and Ginette meet every Friday for just a gab fest where we talk about all things spirit, anything that's kind of prominent right now that's going on. And thanks so much for joining us. So this week, we were kind of talking beforehand, and what we wanted to talk about was what happens essentially to someone's soul or spirit after they pass. So a couple of weeks ago, we were talking about, a lot of people right now, we're seeing like these large numbers of loved ones that are crossing over, and the grieving process and how very human experience it is to grieve. And so we want to take it a little bit to kind of the other side of how we work as mediums and how we connect with loved ones, and help them to see and communicate and understand where their loved one's soul goes and what happens after they cross over. So we would like to shed a little bit of light and bring that side of things to the table today. So thank you, ladies, for joining me, and let's dive in.
All right. So I got to say, it's interesting we're talking about this today because just this morning, I posted on the Avalon Spirit Facebook group. If you guys aren't on that yet, definitely check it out. I posted a really great NDE video, which, I mean, there's so many out there, but there was so many things she mentioned that were similar to mine.
NDE is near-death experience for anyone who doesn't know.
Yes.
Sorry, yes. Continue.
And it was just a beautiful, yet another beautiful story of how the experience can be. So on top of what we're talking about today, I encourage you guys to also explore different NDE videos. There's lots on YouTube, but explore that too, because it continues to color it. Because when souls cross over, one of the things that we've noticed is, yes, there can be similarities, but there's always this specificity to the person, right? Like something specific to that person that really calls them home. And when we consider that when we lose them on this side, they're going home on the other side. And I can vouch for that 100% because when I was there on the other side, I felt like I was home. So I really want to start with that when we lose someone on this side, they have the opportunity to go back to that source, creator, God, whatever your term is. It's a home frequency. And it's a beautiful place to be.
Very much so. And that is actually something that I wanted to talk about. Was a lot of times when I am working with people and I connect to, because obviously I haven't had this experience, but when I connect to a loved one on the other side, I often see that whatever, let's say, belief system that they carried as a human. And so if they were very deeply Catholic, let's say, and they, their vision of passing was being met, with Jesus and Mary, and they had this very kind of traditional belief into the gates of heaven kind of thing. Although there's a lot of similarities when they talk about the light and like really being, without being too cliche, drawn into this light, which is that of like this home perspective, this higher vibrational frequency that is source, heaven. A lot of times, whatever it is that has held them in their human life into that belief, that holding of home, is what greets them, along with loved ones that are there to help them transfer over, so that when that soul does come to that crossing point, they're like, they know it, they trust it before it can fully integrate into that knowing of being home. You know what I mean? They don't carry the density of the human ego belief system so much of wondering, it's not so human, but it's still the crossing over process. So I think that actually brings a lot of people a lot of comfort to know that their loved ones were met by, who they wanted to bring them home. So if they fully believe that they're going to be met by Jesus and, to enter into their perspective of heaven on earth, that is the experience in which brings them into their knowing, or being met by their loved ones that are, like, I'm finally going to be with my spouse that I lost, 15 years ago. Like, they're the ones that greet them and actually are there, like they are bringing them home, which I think, amongst other things, is one of the greatest pieces of peace that we bring to loved ones that are left here on earth. That when their loved ones come through, they validate they
Validate.
validate that for their loved ones, which in my experience, just bringing it through and channeling it, it's like, oh my gosh, it's some of the most peaceful experiences or peaceful feelings that I ever have when I communicate with souls. So I wanted to start off with that, so that anybody watching who hasn't heard Ginette speak about that, or hasn't had a direct experience with communicating with a loved one from the other side, that every single time that they experience or want to explain to their loved one of being met and being brought home on the other side, is being met with that area of comfort that they hold true to them when they're human. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Have you had similar experiences, Ginette and Elyse?
Yeah, Elyse, why don't you go? Because I know you had some experiences, with your dad passing and stuff.
Yeah. And so I'll say too that whether we're speaking to a spirit, whether we're listening to people's NDE stories, there's often this very similar thread of, even if it doesn't look the same, there's this thread of, I felt the deepest love I could ever imagine. Like the way we would define love on this 3D experience, it's like that times a quadrillion, billion, trillion, chillion, right? Like it's just so much more than we could ever experience, which I think is also really gives me a lot of peace, especially when we connect into that space. It's like, you can feel that this person, they still have the aspects that make them them, especially to us and how we related to them in this 3D world. But it's like you were saying, Lisa, without that ego, that human filter that kind of shifts and changes what that looks like. So I always love that, because I always find spirits too, sometimes they'll come through in the way that they want us to recognize them. But when it's energies or spirits that I've connected with regularly, like my dad, they come through as their best self, right? He comes through to me not as he was when he passed, but like his like young ski racing, vibrant self where he was living his best life. And he just really holds that energy with him, which I love. But
yeah,
one thing I want to speak to too, before we even get to the point as a spirit of crossing over and going home, is oftentimes, and certainly there's caveats to this, there's infinite reasons and ways someone will come to pass, right? As we know, whether it's, time for them, whether there's external circumstances, there's so much that can go into it. But, from what I've understood, and even hearing stories of other people, when we're approaching a time of it's getting close to our time to pass, those spirits, those energies, the ones that greet us when it happens are already around us, right? That's where we hear of in like seniors' homes where they're talking to their husband as if he's standing at the end of the bed. I know my grandmother did that. Right before she passed. So it's they're already kind of half there, half not,
Definitely.
Especially when it's a slower process.
Definitely.
And they're kind of like 1 foot in, 1 foot out. And they've already got that channel really open, which I think is really beautiful, because
I do too.
I think that helps with the human fear aspect of it, right? Definitely. Especially if you don't have a heaven belief system or whatever that is for you. And death might feel like a scary thing. So I love that they're there even before. And I know even with my dad before he passed, I didn't realize it at the time. But looking back, he was saying things that it was like, why would you say that unless you knew somewhere deep down your spirit, something was coming through him to speak to, I think my time is coming. And, things that he said, and I've heard this from so many other people, whether it's, that are coming through in readings, or friends who, lose someone or whatever. It's looking back, like they said these things that were like, wow, hindsight, something in them knew. And so for me, sometimes I think that's hard for people, but for me, it gives a lot of peace, because it's to say, like, even as much as we don't want that passing to happen, and even as much as it's hard for us and we experience a grief around it, there is a really beautiful continuation, but also just like a natural process of life. right? And that spirit is involved with us in that before it even happens, like before we even cross over.
Definitely.
Yeah, it's definitely like a tapestry and an alignment of things. And so that's a beautiful thing to share, because no one ever dies alone. Even in the times where I'm sure, like with you guys, when a human is by themselves and they pass, they're not actually by themselves, like you were saying, right? Like it is a known thing on the other side when someone is approaching that gateway or that exit point. So it's a really beautiful thing. If you pull one thing from what we're saying today, is that your loved one never dies alone. And I want to go further with that even if in some cases when somebody passes from either, a drug overdose, sometimes from suicide, different things where it's a very traumatic experience, the soul can pass and feel as if they're alone. Sometimes we've seen in readings, you connect to a soul and they haven't fully crossed over, or they feel they're in the dark. They're really just with their head down, essentially, and not looking up to see that they are in fact surrounded and supported, right? So if there's a fracturing that happens of the soul just prior to passing, even then they're not alone. Even then, when we see ghosts or ghost stories, or, stories where there was a child that died in the house and he's been haunting the house for 60 years all alone, that child energy still is not alone. It's just not seeing how surrounded it is yet and fully crossing over, right? So we never die alone. We are always received, and they're always waiting for us on the other side, but they also won't force awareness either in that transition. They will simply be present and give love until the point in which we are ready to receive it and continue on that journey.
Yeah. And it, building on that, from my experience connecting with souls that have passed traumatically, like instantly, like where nobody got to say goodbye, like in an accident or something like that. Most times, I have to say, that was an exit point. That was a chosen exit point. And if not that point, it would have been a different point in some other way. And so even then, when it happens so quickly, their higher self, their soul has chosen that as an exit point. So what has also brought people a little bit of softness around the area, maybe a little bit of comfort where there's hard to find comfort, is that when the soul chooses that as an exit point, they can, like you were saying, Elyse, when they already kind of are shifting out, 1 foot out, and they already can, before someone passes, maybe if they've been sick for a long time or they're really old or something, they can actually also happen in these quick accidents too, because it's been a chosen exit point. So a lot of times souls will communicate with their loved ones saying, my soul had already chosen to leave, so I wasn't in pain during that. Even when my heart was still beating and my body was still there, they really want their loved one to know that they had already stepped out. And they're like, I didn't feel the pain. Don't hold on to that brutal image and that pain that I felt, because souls always are in agreement with that exit. And so a lot of times they'll step out before that. And so they really want their loved ones to know that at that point in time, they were no longer in that human existence. They were no longer, embodied in that. And so not to hold on to the way in which they pass. Like you said, Elyse, it's like remembering, how they want to be remembered is how they come through. And so for anyone listening, if you're holding on to some of the pain that your loved ones might have felt near the end of their life, I can say, most times, almost all, that is the case. Their loved ones are really wanting them to know that it wasn't, don't remember the pain, because their soul had already stepped out at that point, even if they were even still communicating. They're not feeling that on the same level because they had already chosen that as their exit point.
Yeah. And speaking to that time frame, then after somebody passes, let's say like that 2-week window, there's kind of a quantified 2-week window where really it is what it is, but it tends to be within a couple of weeks of their passing. There can be heightened communication, more messages, signs, symbols. And so I think it'd be great if we talk a little bit about that, like the ways in which spirit does come through when they still are familiar with the density of 3D, because we have to remember that when a spirit crosses over, they move from 3D into 5D or higher, right? And then they reside up here. And then to come back and communicate, they have to learn how to then slow their frequency or densify their frequency again to make manifest something in our world for us to see them. So whether that be flickering lights, turning on the radio, turning up the volume, moving pictures, like they have to learn how to work the physics of 3D in a totally different way, simply by energy, because they don't have hands to move it, right? So sometimes it takes them a little while to figure that out. Not always. Some of them, as you guys know how to do it really quick. But sometimes there's a bit of a lag that happens after that 2-week window. But in that 2-week window, because they remember that frequency, they're still very near and dear to it, there can be some amazing signs, synchronicities, feelings, strong feelings, whooshes of air that come in with a knowing that they've passed. That like you actually feel your hair move, right? Or things like that. So what are some things you guys have experienced, or at least like with your dad passing, or Lisa with the passings that you've recently been through? What kind of things did you guys notice come through in that window?
It was intense. It was really intense. And it was an interesting experience being somebody who connects with people who depart, and then having your dad pass very somewhat unexpectedly. There was a lot of things intuitively that I was expecting, but the timing, the details of it, I had no idea, and it completely caught me off guard. And I remember clear as day, I was, it was a couple days after he passed, and I was standing in my kitchen, and I was leaning on my kitchen island, and I was just sobbing, like just breaking down. And it's going to even make me emotional because it's still so vivid in my mind. His hand was on my back, and he was standing behind me, rubbing my back and saying, "You're okay. I'm here." And it brings me so much emotion even still, because that was one of the most profound experiences with spirit I've ever had, in that it was like he was still, my dad wasn't super well when he passed. And so he wasn't able to provide me a lot of the comfort that I would have needed maybe in hard life experiences. And so to have him there, like in a second, and no one could convince me he wasn't there. Like it just, I could hear his voice. I could feel the pressure of his hand on my back, rubbing my back. I could hear him speaking to me. And sometimes after someone has passed, I don't know if it's everybody, but my brain has a hard time remembering what they sound like. And his voice was so clear and so specific. And I just, like, you could not pay me $1 million to have me, be convinced that that wasn't a real experience. But what was really interesting is that he was so present. I woke up in the middle of the night, and he'd be standing beside the bed, just like, holding space for me, because I'd wake up sometimes in the middle of the night and get these whooshes of emotion, and he'd just be there kind of holding me in that. My boyfriend and I, we had just purchased like new lights, bedside lamps, and mine would always, so they were both brand new, but mine would always flicker. His never would. And to this day, we have the same ones, different house, different place. Mine is the only one that flickers. His does not. There was so many different things where he'd come through with pieces of wisdom, with pick this song for my slideshow, put this song on the playlist for at the funeral. When I did his eulogy, the lights started flickering in the funeral home. But for me, what the interesting experience was he was so present for the couple weeks after he passed. And then it was a Friday the 13th was his funeral. And I remember that Saturday, it was like he was gone. And I think I texted you, and I was mad. I was like, what the hell? Like, I've just gone through one of the hardest days of my life, and now you're gone. And I remember Spirit saying to me, you had tuned in and kind of got an understanding that he was further away, and shared what was going on with him. But I remember in that moment, Spirit shared with me when I was mad, and they said, because I said, now is when I need you the most, right? After the funeral, when we say our goodbyes, that's when people go back to their life. But you as the 3D human are left with your grief experience. And grappling with like, how does life go on without this person in my day-to-day life from a 3D way? And I was like, that is when we need the most support. That is when we need them the closest. And what my guides told me, it wasn't my dad, because he had kind of, stepped back and was going through his own process, was that they have to go through their own process on the other side as well. But that we need to have that distance, because if they are too close, if I every day would get the experience of he's right behind me with his hand on my back, rubbing my shoulders, telling me it's going to be okay, I might not grieve in the really very true, real human way that I needed to, because there was so much. It's hard, it hurts, but there's so much wisdom and beauty and growth and love in grief. And we deny ourselves of that when we don't allow ourselves to be in it and fully experience it. And I think sometimes it's like sticking with the boyfriend that, never leaves, right? You break up, but they're like always texting you. It's like you never have that separation. You never have that space to go through the emotional things that you need to go through. And so that's what they shared with me with my dad specifically, that was really important, is you're a medium. You can talk to them all the time. You need to like hold some space for yourself to not be in that world and experience what it's like to go through a grief process that's really deep.
Yeah, that's definitely a consistent, that they'll step back. And when they do step back, it's usually because it's like, it's time for you to now start moving forward. Yeah.
How about for you, Lisa? What kind of things have you noticed, either for yourself or with clients?
Lots. Personally, when I lost my best friend, she, oh God, it was the hardest thing. So again, the grieving process and trying to connect and wanting to connect. And so she was really open to connect with me and my kids, because she was really close to my kids as well. And then after she went through her time stepping back, for sure. But now, because how she comes through now is like how she was, right? And so that's very, very, very common. But she was so funny. Like, she was so deeply spiritual and amazing, but she was so freaking funny. And like, so her personality will come through. I remember, so one of the biggest things that I have when I'm wanting to connect with loved ones is through music. So like, songs will come on and I'll connect with her and I'll ask her to come through, and then I'll say, hey Siri, play me some music. And then always it's the song. So I suggest somebody do that, because it really works. Music is a good way to connect. Anyway, I was crying so hard. Like, I was in my van and I was crying, like shoulder shrugging, crying. Like, and I remember the mail carrier come, and I didn't notice or whatever. And all of a sudden he like knocks on the window. He's like, you okay? I'm like, yeah, go ahead. Like, I'm on my driveway. Anyway, like deep level sobbing. And then the next song that came on was an absolute, like, ridiculous song, like, that I've never, it was like a Kristen, whoever the voice of Anna is on Frozen. I didn't know she did this song. It's like something so ridiculous. It was so silly. And I just burst out laughing, because she was like, no, girl, like, don't just cry. Like, I'm also this person, like, I'll always be here to lighten the mood too, because she had that like wicked sense of humor. So it was at that moment where I'm like, okay, I can remember you and have some fun with you too, still on the other side. So like, she'll still bring through really comical, funny things. And then, Elyse, when you were saying how you actually heard his voice, it was like 3 mornings ago. And she's passed away for 1.5 years. But 3 mornings ago, I could start to feel her close the other day. And I'm like, oh, she's back. Like, and I was just waking up and I could hear her voice as clear as bell, because she had the most significant voice, and she was just like, hello. And I was just like, oh, you're here. Like, and I could just hear her, and I'm like, good morning. Like, oh, you're close. And then I tuned in and she gave me a couple of messages, but so they'll come through really strongly in different ways at different times. And so how I'm going to bring this now to everybody listening is, I know that when I'm talking with people, a lot of times a loved one will come through and be like, all the things that you thought was me and you were wondering, is it them? I don't know. It was. Yeah. So like, not when you actually experience something and then it's followed by the energy of, I wonder if that was my mom, or I wonder if that was my loved one. They're saying yes. 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 Because it can be in very obvious ways, like flickering lights, but it can be in other ways, like, they'll see a sign, like literally a sign that is up there, and it'll remind them of it, and they were just on their mind, and be like, is that them? Yes, that's them. When you see that bird land on the tree branch right in front of you, the bird fly by. Birds are very often messengers. Feathers, like that kind of stuff is very much of a significance. Dimes, leaving dimes here or there.
Mm-hmm.
Or here's one that always comes through for me is smells. So when I'm reading for someone, all of a sudden I'll be like, oh my gosh, it could be like tobacco. It could be really floral. It could be some kind of baking or like, so sometimes when you just get a whiff of a smell, like if you walk by and you like get a really strong smell of something, that is a way in which they'll bring forward, because the scent system doesn't have to be rewired in your brain circuit. It just goes straight from nose to brain. So it's a really quick way to be able to bring through that for humans. So the senses, stuff like that. So songs and smells, those are ones for sure, which bring a lot of peace. So if you're ever thinking, this happened and they were on my mind and then I saw this, is that them? Yes, it is.
Yes.
So I can bring forward like specific stuff for people, but they're constantly communicating with you. And another thing to remember is that someone's spirit isn't like a one whole body like I am. So it's not like if your loved one has passed and you're like, well, if they're with me, how can they be over there? Like, why are you spending so much time with me and not over there? Like, you're so busy. It's like, yeah, but something to kind of try to understand is that they are kind of an energetic force that is a oneness. So they're multiple places at once. And that's hard to kind of conceptualize in a human form because we're in this like one dense, but when they're in spirit form, they're not just at one place at once. They're not, so they can be experienced amongst all family members in different, and still doing their work on the other side all at once. You know what I mean?
The analogy I love for that is like, just because there's wind here doesn't mean there's not wind across the other side of the globe, right? It can be everything and everywhere all at once, and can show up in different ways. And Elyse, I love that you shared that, because I think oftentimes they'll try and make us laugh or like have lightness in whatever way. I remember my dad, he was so ridiculous, and he passed away right before the pandemic started. And looking back, I think his spirit was like, nope, we're not going to go. We're not going to do that. Right. He was already, it would have just been way too much for him. So I'm actually really grateful of when he chose to pass. But it was right. We were cleaning out the house and looking through all of his things. And it was right when the pandemic started, and hand sanitizer was just not something that was available anymore, anywhere. And we found I don't know why he even had it, because that's always the question, but we found a hand sanitizer that on the bottle said, "Oops, I touched my genitals."
Oh my God.
That's your dad's
died. Humor. It is. But we were just like, it was so funny because we're like, of course, in a hand sanitizer, pandemic, there's no hand sanitizer. And this is the one that we find. Not just good old like Jergens or whatever, but oops.
That was his gift to you guys. That's hilarious.
So my mom still has it sitting on the counter. Like nobody uses it. It's just this full bottle of hand sanitizer that just sits there for calling. It's so funny.
Speaking to the humor of that, I really like that we're talking about this, because Spirit wants to keep things light with us as often as they can. And humor is one of the best ways. And for me, I've seen in different sessions, humor come through many different ways, but for my own experience, I want to share a couple with birds, because birds are often communicators for me from my guides or family members, but I want to share two specifically. One of them was my mother-in-law was over, and I could sense all of a sudden her dad around. We were in the backyard, and her dad would carve ducks. And he was a wood carver in his spare time, and he would carve ducks. And we're standing there. I could feel his presence all of a sudden just come around. I'm like, oh. And then this duck flies through our backyard. Like, usually they fly over, right? It flew through our backyard. I'm like, that was weird. And we're all looking. We're like, that was weird. Then it turns around and starts flying at her head with its wings out. And the duck's like, what's going on? And like just veers and almost hits her. And you can tell the duck was like, what just happened? And I can hear her dad laughing. And it's the way that they can influence their energy and influence animals. So notice how animals are acting too. Because I had one other one just recently. My guides were trying to get me to pay attention to an energy of reassurance. And I was questioning some different things. And they're like, all is well. And I was seeing it in the cards and I was hearing it in different ways, but I was like, I don't know, right? Human brain, monkey brain getting in the way. All of a sudden, this woodpecker lands, it like throws itself at my screen on my window. And instead of landing on the roof, lands on the screen upside down and is looking around like with its claws in the screen and then flies off, comes back, lands again, and is like, what's going on? And it almost seemed like it kept being thrown at my roof, but underneath. And I can hear my guides laughing. And they're like, can you please look up that kind of woodpecker? And sure enough, I look it up and it means all is well, all is okay. But they can do it in the funniest ways, right? Never to endanger, never to harm, but there can be humor. And so It's okay when we receive those messages too from loved ones if they make us laugh, like the hand sanitizer, right? Yeah. Or birds flying at your head. Like it's
and they'll come through in ways so that their loved one will definitely identify. So sometimes like the grandmas will come through with the smells or like they're showing me this and this and this. And so you can 100% know which one it is kind of thing. I had an experience the other day where I was reading for this woman and her uncle, in which she was really close with, came through. And I was like, yeah, he says, and it's so fun. I don't know if you guys can relate to this, but when you're like channeling their energy, I start I was holding myself back at the beginning because I'm like, oh my gosh, like he says and then all of a sudden like swearing like a trucker. Right. And I'm like, he really has a foul mouth. And she's like, totally. Yes, he always just swears so much. And everybody knew that was just who he was because the messages that were coming through were just laden with swears where I'm like, when I do readings, I'm not going to start dropping F-bombs. Right. But this guy did. And so it was almost like a comfort because it was like she knew then his energy and he was there. So it's so funny when we can connect with them that they can still bring through so much of their human stuff for their loved ones to be able to connect with so that it's not just words, but it's like that whole energy. And so they'll work hard to come down and be able to bring that through so that you know that they're holding that almost like how they want to be remembered, how they want you to see it and connect with them, which is really important. And I can say almost always that they don't want you to go back and remember in which the way they passed unless you guys had a very amazing moment. Like sometimes that goodbye moment or that agreement that you made when they passed, like those will bring a lot of comfort that they'll be like, yeah, that's who it is. But always they want to come through with letting you know that they're good, and that's the thing. Just before we leave, do you guys have any, because this keeps coming up, because I've had some personal experience, but also experience with clients about communicating with babies that don't make it to full term. And I know a lot of mamas really struggle because in the healthcare system, it's like, oh yeah, 1 in 3 women experience this, blah, 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 right? Where they're like, they just lost their child, right? And I don't know, I know I have a ton of experience with that, but do you have any lightning words about that soul of that baby?
I actually had one of the most beautiful stories that will forever be ingrained in me with a client session is one time, I think the baby was probably about 25 weeks when it was born and then died very shortly after. And the soul was able to come through in the reading even less than 24 hours after they had technically physically passed. And the vivid memory of that little baby was so beautiful. And when we say a little baby, they're not a baby soul. They are a whole soul coming into baby form to grow. So this is like a fully functioning soul. And they were able to come through and describe what their mom looked like, what their dad looked like, the blanket they were wrapped in, what was in their kind of hospital bassinet, who was holding them, like down to what the t-shirt looked like, the descriptions on it. And it was all beautiful. And in many cases, I do want to say as a general rule of thumb, in many cases, when there is a birth like that, it can be that there was a malfunction in the body, and that soul is going to come right back around again in a pregnancy very soon. And that was the case in this one. There are some cases where, as you guys know, it was a journey of experiencing loss, and then the soul will decide to stay on the other side. But oftentimes, the soul will come back around again. And in this case, with this one, that's what they were saying. So even with babies that aren't full term or are born and then passed, even if they are full term, like they're so supported too. And they're so freshly from the other side that they are so all-knowing, even more than an adult would be in crossing. Like they are just like, oh, no, not yet, I'll be back. Or like there's even more knowledge and support with them. So I always find that comforting.
Definitely. I know that's super comforting for mamas that I've talked to. Is some came through so that they could, one particular one was lost in earlier pregnancy, probably like 10 weeks, but, and it came through as a girl, but like, that doesn't mean anything. And this baby the soul wanted the mama to know that she wanted her mom to experience the closeness enough to be connected soul-wise so that she could identify the energy of her as a soul guide, so that she talks and she communicates with her, knows that she's there. So much so that because she had that much experience with her when she carried her for 10 weeks. And although that was so like devastating for the mama, she has this lifelong guide that is with her and on that side, and so like there was so much information and she just felt so much peace with that. So that was one in which the soul didn't come through. But for me, I had 2 miscarriages, and I mean, so devastating. The first one, I had my due date of October 6th, and I, had this healthy pregnancy, and then I lost the baby, and it was just like, oh, what happened? And then I got pregnant like right after, basically, with a boy, ended up being my son. And then my daughter came after my son, and she was born on October 6th. And when I went in and communicated with her soul, and this is so her personality, she is like, put me first. I can't wait. Like, go. And I'm like, it was because soul agreements within the family too. It wasn't her turn. Like she jumped the gun. And August was supposed to be the older brother, right? Like that was the dynamics in which the soul agreed. So she was like, fine. I could just see Marley. Totally. So she came in, and the miscarriage when I was pregnant with my 4th and then lost was a timing thing. And we ended up having to sell our house, travel the world, and do all this stuff. And then my youngest came through when we came home, because she wasn't like, because we had to have that travel experience. We wouldn't have if she, and it was a whole timing thing. And so she waited, and then came in. And so, I mean, retrospect, I figured it out that way. But there's a lot of peace that can come with understanding the soul's journey from losing babies. And lots of times, actually, it is the child that was born after or for a different reason, or, and so if anybody that if you're listening or if you've had that experience, please reach out if you feel inclined, because oftentimes that can bring a lot of women peace, because that is often a grieving process of losing, a pregnancy, a baby that you're pregnant with, that a lot of people that struggle with for a long time. And you know what I mean? And don't have a ton of support with. And this can often bring some peace. So I really wanted to just add that in, because it's such a big one in my life.
Absolutely. Yeah. All right. Any final thoughts, ladies? Any closing statements?
I could talk about this for hours.
I know, right? It's true.
Yeah.
It's true.
I have to say that it is a pleasure. And every time that I do a reading and bring through loved ones, afterwards, I'm always like, oh, thank you for choosing me to bring that message forward, because it is such a beautiful experience to be able to connect with somebody's energy so that they can pull it in and feel it. Like I said, more than just words. Yeah. So I'm just so grateful
Absolutely.
and honored that I can have that. And I also have that kind of peace of mind, as I know both you do, to know the peace on the other side.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I really hope that this helps everyone kind of feel the lighter side of death and dying, because we are in an energy, we're in an energy under Scorpio with the eclipses of astrological alignments, which facilitate or open a gateway of sorts of more passings.
Yeah.
That's one. But also with the massive change on the planet right now, we are seeing a lot more passings. So I really hope, and I know we all hope together, that this helps to lighten the experience or the ponderings of death, of the assuredness that the soul is cared for, regardless of how it happens on the other side. If we leave you with nothing but that and some laughs, then, we fulfilled our duty today.
Yeah.
So, yeah. All right. Well, everyone, thank you so much for joining us as always. Please do subscribe and share if you're interested. And also check out avalonspirit.com to connect with us as well. So we will see you guys again next week.
Mwah.